welcome everybody. My name is Raphael Hyde. I'm one of the Google Web3 leads, and today we have Alex, who is the co-founder and CTO of Immutable, and we're going to chat about his project, his Web3 journey, and all the great things he's been up to. So let's start with a little introduction. As I mentioned, Alex is running Immutable, and I believe that's kind of been most of his work history. So we'll just jump right into it. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here.
Awesome. And why don't you tell everybody where you're calling in from? I think you're the furthest guest we've had.
Yes, no, I'm calling in. It's 9 a.m. on Wednesday the 27th down here in Sydney, Australia.
Awesome. Well, that's pretty. We really appreciate your flexibility and being able to pivot your schedule. I know you're a busy guy. So why don't we get into that? Why don't we hear a little bit what got you into Web3 and technology? Maybe you have there was a primal event where you got exposed to something and then you realized this is kind of what I have to do.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there was ever one massive event, but I'll say happened for me was that I got very interested in all sorts of election software, actually it was. And I was looking around for various tools that existed to help make things like online voting substantially easier. This is in sort of 2015, 2016. And one of the technologies that was suggested to me was a technology called Ethereum. Ethereum ended up being basically a dead end for online voting. A lot of the problems that you have to solve with online voting are it's more like fundamental identity challenges than it is blockchain challenges. But I fell in love with Ethereum as a technology. And at that stage, Ethereum actually didn't have, it feels bad to say this at this point, didn't really have applications. Right? Mm-hmm. There wasn't really, you couldn't go out and use DeFi. Everything was very much in beta mode. And as someone who comes from a technology background, I found it super fascinating that we had this very different computing environment. We had a new virtual machine. We had new programming languages. We had new node client software. And I basically just sort of threw myself into the open source Ethereum space, right? So working on a bunch of those fundamental tools, which were at the time fairly primitive, being used by not many people, mostly out of academic interest, right? It actually wasn't until a couple of years later, I think I'll introduce, I guess, the story of Immutable in a few seconds, but it wasn't until a few years later that really big turn from here's an academic interest in what can be achieved with this technology into we can actually build something really concrete here.
Gotcha. That's pretty cool. And you mentioned voting, and I'm curious because that's a part of your background that I am unfamiliar with. So why were you working on voting, and how has that kind of sculpted your work now? Because I feel that democratic interest is so largely what Web3 is about today.
Yeah, I would say, I'll be clear here. Like I was a university student at the time working on this as research projects, right? What really attracted me about voting software was basically like the same type of ethos that is really rampant throughout Web3, which is like, what can we do better to give people better access to all sorts of institutions, right? If that's opening up voting access, if that's making it simpler for people to go through these systems, if that's opening up better ways of voting, right? So there are, for anyone who's interested in psephology generally, there are lots of different algorithms that you can use to count people's votes, right? There's weighted voting, there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it to achieve slightly different outcomes. Right? Mm-hmm. That is such an interesting topic in general about how we interface with democracies. And for me, I think that's really carried over into Web3, which obviously is all about the hey, can we push power towards the edges of the social graph? I think the overall ethos has remained the same, even if the particular interest in voting is somewhat scaled back over time.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So you were in school, you were really interested in voting and the technology and I guess the properties and the network effects of that, and then got exposed to Ethereum. How did Immutable happen? That seems like quite a leap because it's obviously a much more sophisticated project.
Yeah, so I think the big jump came when I was quite deep in the Ethereum space, right? So at this stage, I was practically working in the Ethereum open source space full time and having that experience of you're just fully head down, how can we make that, how can we get this ecosystem to some stage of maturity, right? And by that stage, we'd started to see some applications. So we'd seen things like the DAO, right? We'd seen things like the ICO boom in 2017, right? And none of that was particularly interesting to me. You know, I was sort of like building the technology for something that was sort of coming in the future, but hadn't really got here yet. And one day, I think really the story of Immutable is that we saw the first NFT projects. Right? And when I'm talking about the first NFT projects, I'm talking there about, you know, CryptoPunks, even sort of the start of CryptoKitties in very late 2017. Right? And I remembered an experience that I had had many years prior. So several years before the voting story, I played a lot of video games, right? And I played rather a lot of video games. I played Counter-Strike semi-professionally. Right? I won an Australia Championship in another game, and I also got, as part of that experience, extremely deep into Steam item trading. Not sure if there are many people here who come from that background, right? But there's basically so as soon as we started having free-to-play games, one of the first big movers there was Steam, with games like Team Fortress 2. Right? And in those games, a huge part of the game was the economy around skins or hats or items inside the games that people could trade for money. Right? The trading ecosystem was very primitive. It was a lot of like used to send yours to a middleman. Someone else would send money to the middleman, and the middleman would make the swap because you couldn't trade things directly for dollars. And every once in a while, that person would walk off with all the money. Right? And there was a huge reputation system. Steam's eventually released their own marketplace, but took a 15% fee on transactions. You weren't able to ever convert it into real dollars. You could only convert it into Steam money. So there was this whole ecosystem that developed, and I built websites. I did price suggestions. I wrote these big long economics blogs about the space. It was a very nerdy time for me, I'm afraid. Right? And what that gave me was when we saw those first NFT projects emerging, right, for the first time, I felt, okay, I have this really strong, almost like academic background in Ethereum. Here is a use case where I actually think we can make smart contracts, right? And we could use the technology of Ethereum to actually make the trading and ownership of these items substantially better. Right? And so it was seeing, okay, here's actually a combination of those two big, passion pillars of the last 10 years of my life coming together was, I think, the foundation for Immutable.
Wow, that is such a serendipitous path to take. You really had the most incredible groundwork training to understand the technology, and then obviously being a user of yourself in the gaming world. So, when you were at that point, then did you already have co-founders? Like, how did the actual project or business come together? Yeah, maybe explain us how that happened.
Yeah, so Immutable has 3 co-founders. There are James and Robbie, who are brothers, right, and myself. James and Robbie already knew each other, obviously, and I had known Robbie when we were at university together. Right, so it was a sort of a group of people who were interested in the same sort of stuff and were working on Ethereum at a similar time.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting. And then were you guys already working on other projects together, or was this the first one?
This was the first one that I think we took seriously. We'd done some stuff before, whenever they'd had ideas previously, they'd sent it over to me, their friend who knew something about Ethereum, and I would say, no, guys, I think this isn't going to work for this reason, right? And so I think when this started coming about, we knew who we were going to talk to about it.
And so I know a lot of people in the call work on projects or technology that kind of extends all over the world. And obviously Immutable is a giant project. You have huge partnerships. And so in the beginning, maybe help us understand how you chose to start out, because it's obviously lasted the test of time. And that's super impressive. Yeah,
I mean, maybe it'll help a bit if I talk about what Immutable does first, and then I'll sort of take you back to the beginning of that. Right. So,
perfect.
Immutable is, I would say, one of the leading companies in Web3 gaming as a whole. Right. In particular, right, we have 2 sort of main lines of business. We have a studio, and that studio makes currently 2 titles. The first is Gods Unchained, which you may have heard of. The second is a game called Guild of Guardians, which is in alpha at the moment, and it will be in public beta later in the year. Right. And the second is a platform. Basically, there are so many challenges that you face. If you actually want to build a game that people would actually play in a Web3 context, it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult for a ton of reasons. There's scale reasons, there's user experience reasons, there's compliance reasons, there's custody reasons, there's wallet UX reasons. Like all the way across the board, there are problems. Immutable basically exists as a platform for solving those problems. And that's where we are today. I'll talk a little bit about how we make some of that happen later. This was the original vision that we'd had when we started out, was that I mentioned that I came from a playing games background. I actually didn't come from a game development background. The first thing that we wanted to do was to build that platform product. And we went around to game studios, and this is now in very early 2018, and we talked to them all about, okay, you guys should build a Web3 game, and we'll solve the challenges for you, and we'll build the right product to solve them. And most of them were like, yes, we are definitely very interested in having these problems solved for us. And we were like, okay, so when do we start? Let's go. And they were like, well, I mean, it's a great idea, but we're not quite committed just yet, and we'll see how it goes in a few years, right? And so Immutable's story really revolves around us having the realization that we needed to be our own first and best customer. So we built fully fledged games, right, which are some of the highest quality games in the blockchain space today, right, out of a need to prove out this thesis, like, are these games something that people actually want to play, right? And B, give ourselves a bit of a competitive advantage when it comes to identifying the problems that these game developers and users would have when they actually had built a proper game, right? The games at the time were very much, you're in the browser, you're sort of like, you buy something for a lot of money, and then you just kind of hold it and you look at it in the browser, and maybe there's like a tangential mini game. We were very committed to the idea of, okay, let's build a proper game that people would play, even if it didn't have a Web3 economy, and then layer in and integrate a Web3 economy over the top and do it really, really well. So that was, I think, what we had to do to start off, was almost like, build a customer, right? Because one didn't quite exist just yet.
Oh, I love that. Can you show us? Why don't we take a peek, and you can walk us through a little bit of what this looks like?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I'll show you a couple of things, right? I think the first thing I will show you is, let me share my screen.
Thanks, Alex.
I think the first thing I will show you is the Immutable marketplace, right? So Immutable basically operates as a backend for many marketplaces, right? So you can trade Immutable NFTs on, there's a marketplace that we make. There's also other marketplaces like, for instance, a token trove, right? We also have support on marketplaces like Immutable. OpeaSea support is going to be rolling out over the next few months, right? And you can go to each of these marketplaces, and the big differentiator for Immutable X, let's trade an asset in God's Unchained, is firstly that we support very low value assets. So if you look here, some of the cheapest cards in God's Unchained are worth 2 cents each.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you're trading a 2-cent card, right, and you're attaching several dollars or tens of dollars to gas fees in that is going to terribly distort your economy. And one of the big dangers there is you react to that by creating, okay, we're only going to have 10,000 assets, right? Or like, we're going to have some super scarce asset collection. That's obviously not what gamers actually want. Gamers don't mind if there are like tiers of scarcity relating to things like cosmetics. But when it comes to utility, if only 100 people can actually have one of the stronger cards in the game, or can build a particularly desired deck, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Right? And these are the same challenges that real world traditional card games face all the time. So if we just look at the product for a second, I mean, what you see here is a fairly normal NFT marketplace, right? You can do a bunch of filtering, right? You can play around with various settings. What I want to show you, which I think is more differentiating for Immutable, right, is when I go buy now here, right, I get the pop-up on the right. I assume everyone can see this. Right. Immutable operates as what's called a zero-knowledge rollup, which means that we retain Ethereum's security, but we can basically, a good way of thinking about it is we're like an optimization service for taking many, many Ethereum transactions, right, and proving them really efficiently on layer one, which means that you can do things like this. Right. I'm just signing a string here, and I've purchased the asset. Right. And if I go back here, I own this asset. Right. A couple of things I'll call out there. The first is obviously that was a really quick transaction. Right. You can make an API call and have things settled synchronously, which makes things feel much more like a traditional Web2 experience. The second really important thing that I want to call out there is that a lot of chains have sort of like a similarly fast confirmation time, but have transaction fees, right? Or they have variable transaction fees. And what I mean by that is you'll notice that if I go to send an Ethereum transaction, right? So if I, for instance, need to go and buy an NFT on OpenSea, I'll have to pay what's called a gas fee. And a gas fee is a variable amount of money that basically like you're paying for computation based on the demand on the rest of the network. So if more people want to do things at around the same time as you, you're going to pay more. It's like a market mechanism. On layer 2, what we're able to achieve there, you'll notice that I didn't set a transaction fee. Right? And that's because Immutable X is able to operate without a gas mechanism at all. We take a fee from the percentage of each sale, right? Rather than taking a flat fee based on the NFT, which sets us up much more nicely because when you have 2-cent NFTs like the one that we're talking about here, me purchasing those and paying some flat gas fee is going to make trading those uneconomical. The other important thing there is that it makes it very difficult. You've got to think that many of the people who are trading here are trading to make some sort of profit, right? They're going and they want to say, okay, I'm going to buy, this one is Ash Reader, the card. I'm going to buy this, and then maybe I'll make a really popular deck which includes this card so that other people want to buy it. Right? But if the gas price has fluctuated so much, like let's say that the card doubles from 2 cents to 4 cents, in many other places, that's a great trade, right? I've just made a big profit. But if gas is high at the time that I want to settle that trade, I could be losing money completely on the whole thing. And so getting to the point where we can have fast transactions with no gas fees without compromising Ethereum security is a very, very important sort of UX milestone for games and for users generally.
That's huge. And I believe you mentioned before that Immutable is the largest marketplace using ZK rollups.
Yeah. So at the moment, Immutable is one of the leading. I'm sure people on the call will have heard about Ethereum layer 2 scaling. Immutable is one of the largest there, both by user count, right, and by transaction volume. The thing that we're really proud of with Immutable X, we don't have the highest NFT volume. Right? Ethereum layer 1 still dominates everyone in terms of how much people are paying each other for NFTs. Right? What we have, and something we're really proud of, is we have the most individual NFT trades on our platform, right, of any of the major platforms. Right? And that's because the users who are playing games like Unchained, or like if you go back to the start of the marketplace, there are a ton of different assets here, whether it's in a game like Guild of Guardians here, if it's something like Alluvium Land, for those of you who've heard of Alluvium, right? People are buying these assets for the utility that they have in games. And that means that there's a base load demand that is not just like, hey, we think it's going to go up. There's a big spiky surge of demand, and then everything sort of falls away on the other side of that, right? We really want to invest in, have we created a good experience for the people who are trading assets for utility? And that's resulted in us being able to do like a very large number of NFT transactions.
That's incredible. And in our past conversation, you mentioned how there are a little bit different behaviors in the markets, in the different gaming markets around the world. How did you kind of react to that, or how did that influence the development of what you guys have built here?
Yeah, I mean, so what I'll talk about then, I'll just stop sharing my screen for a second. We can jump back to that later if it's interesting. A couple of points, right? So obviously everyone will have heard about NFT gaming or NFTs in gaming at this point. Super common topic, right? And if you go and you talk to many people who are playing games at the moment, or if you go on Reddit, you'll see that lots of people are not super passionate about the idea of NFTs being introduced into their games.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we approach this is mostly by agreeing with those people. Right? A lot of the games that have been produced that use NFTs are terrible, right? And a lot of the mechanics that people have used NFTs for are pretty bad in terms of like the player experience that they create. Right? I think what we've got to remember here is that like NFTs, we see them as an enabler of certain economic mechanics. Right? We have a really strong vision that's baked into what we saw in the Steam ecosystem, what you see today in people trading for World of Warcraft gold, what you see in economies like EVE Online, like all these complex economies. We think that they can be uplifted by NFTs. Right? But as a player, particularly in a Western gaming market, right, those players simply, I would say, like, and probably fairly, don't trust game studios to roll out technologies that are not going to like aggressively monetize them. So they see NFTs as the latest in a line of, okay, this thing has been manipulative, and they're in some way trying to extract more money from me. We have a couple of points there. Right? The first is That's not true for all markets in the world. I think in particular, Southeast Asian markets have reacted much more positively to these types of NFTs. Right? You've seen that with some of these play to earn games, but also just generally when it comes to the way that those markets treat things like paying to win in games, right? And also the way that those games economies are generally structured. There are really substantial geographic differences when it comes to what people expect from those games. Right? At Immutable, we're not big fans of play to earn. Right? Basically, the way that we see it is like, if the only way you can get people to play your game is by paying them lots of money or trying to give them a full-time wage, A, you're going to have an unsustainable economy, and B, you should have just made a more enjoyable game. Right? But seeing what that looks like, for different people all around the world is a really, really interesting point. Our philosophy in general for all of the above is that we think that gamers actually will get substantial value out of NFTs. But unless NFT projects and NFT games are willing to actually build something that is genuinely fun and genuinely has value added to it, I see no reason why gamers should believe them. Right? So unless we can actually point to something and say, part of the reason why we build our own games here at Immutable, in fact, right? Unless we can point to something and say, hey, we built this, isn't this an upgrade on what systems exist at the moment? Right? I think, short of that, there's no reason for gamers to embrace this sort of technology.
I love that honest perspective that you have on that, because I think that would really change the conversation, at least the ones that I've been a part of, around whether or not NFTs have a home in gaming. Can you share a couple of examples of the types of NFTs or utilities that you guys have focused on, where you've noticed the most traction, and maybe some where you've noticed the opposite?
Yep. So I can probably talk to two clear examples here, right? And obviously, you can measure traction in lots of different ways. So I'll clarify that as well. I think one area where we've seen plenty of traction is just in the replacement for sort of skins and cosmetics in games, right? So one easy way to introduce NFTs into your game is if you're saying, okay, we're not going to fundamentally change the utility of the assets. Let's say everyone can still play this game and they'll all have access to the same weapons. But the cosmetically enhanced versions of those weapons are going to be tradable and people are going to be able to exchange them, is a much simpler economic design than trying to merge those two concepts together, right? So as a place to start, just operating based on people want to own shiny weapons for status reasons or because they think it looks cool or to show off to their friends, right? That definitely has a very strong, and I think that will likely be where the earliest stuff is adopted. Right? The second area that I think we've seen strong adoption so far is in things which are almost analogies to real world games. A lot of the way that we talk about blockchain card games, the way that I like to think about them, is that we used to have a huge. I'm sure we have a few Magic the Gathering players here. Right, that's a huge tradable card economy. You can play the game, right? You trade the cards. Different cards are scarcer than others, and the whole thing works, right? And what happened was when the first wave of digital trading card games came out. So there we're talking about things like Hearthstone. Right, we got a couple of really big benefits. We got a convenience benefit. You could play with anyone, anywhere around the world, whenever you wanted. You could have, more complex game mechanics. You could have the whole thing, the board covered in explosions and tons of different calculations. You have to fight over the rules. Right, you had good matchmaking, so you could find a game with someone your skill level. And the trade-off was, you got all these things, but you lost the tradability and ownership of the cards. We think that where there's analogies to almost those real world economies, but where it's uplifting, okay, here is a digital game that lost that in the journey, and we can do some sort of fusion of here's a Hearthstone and here's a Magic the Gathering. That sort of mirroring or mapping to real world economies is another good place that we've seen some traction. Where we've seen less traction has generally been in a couple of areas. The first is in extremely exclusive or scarce pre-sales. So if you're just selling, here's 5,000 extremely rare, almost the profile picture style project, that works really well if what you're selling is essentially a luxury good. If it's just me, I'm buying this for exclusivity, I want to have a particular avatar that other people don't have, that works for that use case. If you're doing it for game items, you've got to be very careful about that. Right? You don't want to go too far down the path of, now I've created a totally fun game because some people don't have the assets. The second case that I think we've seen not work sustainably so far is extremely aggressive play to earn, right? Where people are sort of earning minimum wage or above in their countries by playing this game. Right? In general, those economies I think have been found to be unsustainable in things like OpeaSea and things like Steppen. It's one area where I think the jury is still a little bit more out. There's lots of projects that have done land sales, which are intending to provide some sort of like ongoing, benefit stream. That's a new mechanic. I don't think it has many analogies in traditional gaming. I think, that one is one where we're really going to have to wait and see which projects do a good job of it and which projects don't.
Thank you for explaining the segmented markets, especially like I think the two spectrums of land that has it's still kind of undetermined economics, all the way to the gaming mechanics that you obviously very, very familiar with. I'm curious because I find that a lot of the users that might be in gaming might be similar to the ones that are trading NFTs and not gaming, or I guess I don't really know where that split is. So are you finding that you can actually lean on some of the habits or like behaviors in traditional NFT markets and in gaming? Like, is that a potential space to explore and to like extend what Immutable is doing and not just focusing on gaming NFTs?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are obviously a couple of, a lot of our technology works just as well for any other type of NFT, right? Like, who's to say what becomes a game, right? Like, is a collectibles website a game? Is something like NBA Top Shot, for those who've used that, is that a game, right? You're collecting things, you're building out your inventory. Our product strategy is to focus on games because we think that the needs of games are substantially different, right? Like here, I showed you a demo of an NFT marketplace, which sort of has our like back end under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
You've also got to remember, like, that same back end could be under the hood inside a game where you're like, someone kills you in Call of Duty, and on the death cam, their gun, their weapon sort of flashes up, and you can click buy, right? There are like really particular needs that games might have, which other types of NFTs don't have just yet. And so from a focus perspective, we're very dialed into that market. Over time, I think it's likely that we expand, but we wouldn't want to expand too early or like too frivolously. I think one thing the Web3 space like really commonly gets wrong is saying, okay, we're going to have this like super wide technology product that works for everyone, rather than like, we're going to solve these 5 problems for this particular customer set, and we're going to do a really great job of that. I think that's sort of like more the spectrum that more the end of the spectrum we're trying to be on.
That totally makes sense. And you mentioned like, you don't want to fail on any of those experiments to not suit the customer's needs. Could you share any experiments that you are either running now or looking forward to running to learn what the next step and what you could offer your users is?
Yeah. I mean, one clear one is wallets, right? At the moment, we support people sort of like bringing your own Ethereum wallet to use with our platform. Right? We are likely to roll out over the next few months. I'm not sharing anything super alpha here. We're likely to roll out sort of our own integrated wallet product. Right? People will still be able to use their own existing wallet products if that's what they're bringing. Right? But we also want to make sure that for new users to the space, who are going to be the majority of users in the space, right, we give those people an option to have a user experience that works for normal gamers as well. Right? There are a few variations there. We're looking to test out like, what does that mean in terms of custody for keys? Right? There are a few options that we can do there. Right? What does that mean in terms of like the right onboarding flow? What does that mean in terms of the right way to on-ramp funds? Right? At the moment, we offer credit card payments. Right? We offer moving funds from layer 1. How important is it for us to offer on-ramps from centralized exchanges? Like if you've already got your money in Coinbase or Binance and you want to like on-ramp that to pay for assets really simply, how do we prioritize that against other things? I think for us, the experiments that we're running are more geared towards helping us prioritize. There are so many problems for us to solve. We want to solve the right ones in the right order. And that's, I think, the general trajectory of our experiments.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I see so many projects like trying to center around the wallet. Do you see there being more of a consolidation of wallets within the verticals of Web3 per se? Or do you forecast there might just be like a plethora of options that are just like turnkey for a particular use case?
So one thing I'll say is that wallets are extremely sticky. Right? And that's because wallets are really scary. Like when you download a MetaMask, like if you download MetaMask and you save your seed phrase, the idea of like switching to another wallet, even if you really don't like the user experience, you've got to sort of like get your seed phrase out. You've got to go and copy your private key, move it into another app. Like, do you trust the other app or other people using it? That's a really scary and unfriendly experience, right? And most people feel insecure about it.
Mm-hmm.
Which means in general, people stick around with their wallets. Right? I mean, I think certainly there will start to be like some consolidation in wallets where people, move towards winners, right? I think one thing that we're going to have to deal with though as an industry is like, hey, let's say that there are 30 wallets eventually with millions of users.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to support them all in your app or your game? Are you going to show them a drop down where they choose which wallet they have? Right? Some of the existing Ethereum standards don't work super well for like discovering which custodial wallets users have or in areas like that. I think we'll probably see we'll definitely see winners emerge, but I think we're going to have to grapple with the fact that a lot of users are going to end up with, we might even be in a future where users have several wallets. They had their MetaMask, which they used for this purpose. And then they also got a custodial wallet when they signed up for this game. That's a bit of a problem because it means that funds that are available in one big box aren't available over here. Mm-hmm. So as a game, you'd want to be very careful before you say, okay, we're only going to support our custom wallet, right? Because maybe that's excluding you from accessing people who have, let's say they've got thousands or tens of thousands of dollars of ETH in their MetaMask. Right? If you want to set up your game so that those users can't actually access it, that's probably going to impact you on the financials.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of the race to the bottom of the browser with wallets. So I really want to hear what your experience was like building games, because I know that takes years and is super competitive. So why don't you share a little bit how that started and how'd you consider what aspect of game development to focus on?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say, I'm sure I'm not, maybe preaching to the choir here, is that building games is extremely hard, right? It's very difficult. It takes a long time. You see a lot of NFT projects announcing these days that, hey, we're going to do our game and it's going to come out in 4 months, right? Or we're going to do buy it and integrate things and all sorts of strategies. The truth is just making fun games takes time. It takes experimentation. It takes testing, particularly if you want to be quite ambitious, right? And our ambitions were, how could you create a game that people would want to play, right? Even if it didn't have web3 as a label, right? And we actually didn't come from, as I said before, from a direct games industry background. So we had to go and we hired a team of people who'd been there before, right? We used them to start building the game, right? At the same time, we moonlighted. I used to do art direction for the early days, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I would people would make things and I would give them feedback, right? I think there's definitely a bit of a scrappiness there to getting these types of things off the ground, right? But I also think people generally need to take that challenge really seriously, and there's a reason that the games industry builds games the way that it does, right? And coming from obviously everyone from a software background is yeah, we could totally do everything, we'll just apply our traditional methodologies and things like that. A bunch of that will work. A bunch of those things will need to be adapted to make sure that we are taking the right choice. There's a reason that you need a game design team, right? There's a reason that you're going to have to think very carefully about the platforms that you support and do you offer Linux support and all those sorts of things are decisions you have to make extremely intentionally. I would say we probably if we had our time again, we would definitely go out and speak to the real experts much earlier than we did to really just get it, tell us everything that we need to know going into this, give us the benefit of your experience. We probably trial and error a little bit too much in retrospect.
Gotcha. And when you say experts, who would you say are the experts now? I mean, you guys have kind of become the experts, but in the gaming universe, we're seeing large acquisitions happening. Yeah, who would you claim to be the experts in the gaming space?
So certainly not, right? I think we definitely have, I would say, a differentiating expertise in what it takes to build Web3 games. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think people who are interested in building Web3 games specifically should talk to us. But even then, building a game is it's so challenging because it requires a large team for a long time. You're going to have to go and outsource your art. You're going to insource the art. How are you going to support mobile? All those types of decisions. You need to talk to people who've had previous experience building the type of game that you want to make and scaling that game over its entire life cycle, right? So from hey, we're building it to the start line, and then we're taking it from the start line to being an ongoing live services game. You want to sort of form some sort of panel of advisors for people who've done those specific things beforehand. And the more successful the game has been, right, the more I think you can sort of speak to, hey, what it takes to actually go through that whole journey. With the consolidation that's taking place, I mean, I think there are one thing we're very grateful for now is there are tons of studios who are now like, they've gotten really good at building these types of games.
Gotcha. And I'm really curious, so do you have like a top 3 studios that you admire?
Yeah, I think we definitely, from a like what they've shipped recently perspective, we definitely like Riot. I think they've had a really big couple of wins. It's both with like the launch of Valorant, like launching Legends of Runeterra at the same time, starting out like the live services sort of empire of League of Legends, now becoming a multi-game studio. I think that's been a very successful past couple of years for them. Right? I mean, I could equally as well talk about, I think, Blizzard for like the longevity of their games, right? And the fact that they've been able to continue like putting content into that ecosystem for a very long time. And I think I'm probably bound by like the way that I got my start was in the Steam ecosystem. So I feel like I have to say Valve, both for like, I think definitely less strong on the like, hey, what have you shipped recently? But obviously, leveraging some of the best games that were built in that 2000s to 2010s period, turning that into like the biggest games distribution platform on earth. That's pretty impressive. If you gave me a fourth, I'd probably have to say Epic. I think they're killing it both with Fortnite and with like the work on UE5 and with competing with Steam with the Epic Game Store. I think they're like putting themselves in a really, that would be someone who I would definitely be talking to if I to like help progress my understanding of the future of the space.
Gotcha. And as you guys grow, obviously you're taking a very bullish approach on NFTs and gaming, and that has definitely not been the case for a lot of the other gaming studios or large tech companies out there. So what would you say to them? Do you think it's like they're making a wrong decision with their strategy, or what?
I'd say I'd slightly almost disagree with the premise. I'd say like every major game studio on earth has had detailed conversations with us over the past year, right? I think we are now reaching a point where a lot of these studios are very interested in Web3 and NFTs, right? They're very interested in the future of monetization. They don't want to get left behind. They don't want to like miss the train on mobile or miss the train on social or miss the train on like free to play. They're very interested in being at the start of this wave. What they don't want to do is be the first mover, right? So like no one wants to sort of like be the person who puts themselves out there for public criticism and has to solve all the problems without necessarily winning. I think what we're likely to see is, from my perspective, their strategy is probably right. The strategy I'd do is like wait for people who are more native to the space, and whether that's us, whether that's someone like an Illuvium, like a Mythical, like there are a number of sort of studios who are going to produce content there. Once those hypotheses are actually demonstrated and you have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, that's the point that I'd start taking it out of the R&D team and into like, let's actually commit to this. Like games are a huge upfront investment. The idea that all sort of like AAA game studios will just immediately decide to go and build these titles without seeing much validation, I think is a pretty crazy one, right? So like, I'd say, don't see, the fact that they haven't launched titles as like, they're not interested in this technology. They're very interested. The thing that they've got to get right is like, let's make sure that this thing is actually going to work before we spend, 8 figures on building a game and shipping it and linking it natively to this technology.
And that makes a lot of sense. And I guess then my follow-up would be, for companies like Google, or I guess any other native Web 2 companies, what do you think we should do? What do you think our place should be in this Web 3 world?
I mean, I certainly think there are just products that you guys can offer which are extensions of current Google products, or which are just going to provide usefulness and utility into the space, right? I think there are, like, that's probably the way that I would start, rather than trying to do something like extremely native. It would be like, first come to grips with the state, with the space by like taking our products to a better place with regard to Web3. Whether that's like, there I'm thinking about, what could Google Pay do here, right? Or Google Wallet, as it's recently, the app's recently been rebranded, right? What could Google do around the extension of like the Google login and identity system, right? What could Google do to offer better protection for cryptographic keys in Chrome, right? Or like, I think there's just a bunch of areas where like you'd almost want to get into the space by like offering valuable products and services you can approach with, not like, hey, we're going to go out and change the world with this one big new product, but like we're going to really familiarize ourselves with building great Web3 products by extending our existing suite, right? I think the other thing that you got to think about there is like, where things like, obviously Google has, enormous power with, Android in the mobile ecosystem, with Chrome on the desktop ecosystem, like the way that it leverages those platforms to either like, support Web3 stuff generally, and like what tools it can put in the hands. Basically, I'd say like, how can Google make sure that it makes it as easy as possible for the people who will be doing that first wave innovation in Web3 to actually get like, from my perspective, like I want Google to help so many of the businesses in Web3 keep their users safer, right? Help their users access these types of funds, right? And make sure that we put good guardrails around that type of utility is probably the recommendation that I'd make.
Gotcha. And then when it comes specifically to like Immutable, are there any areas of improvement that, a company of our scale and reach with infrastructure or search or YouTube that would help leverage or further empower the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so definitely a couple of things which are like, always on our mind. The first is like Play Store guidelines, right? Like we often deal with lots of customers who are releasing crypto or Web3 related apps, right? Or they want to release their game, and it's got you're buying things with crypto, or you're doing something there. Clearer guidelines that are like actually that we can sort of like pass on as advisory to customers. Like I think we work with you guys directly. We work with Apple pretty directly, but that's just like a relationship that we've had. We've spent time on. We've worked through a whole bunch of like this and this. Clearer guidelines for the ecosystem, super valuable to us. Right. I think the like helping to have people understand that the ownership of these assets is something that is superior to Web2 ownership is also really important, right, to us. Whether that's okay in Google products, we can help people, even just being able to see your NFTs in your Google account, or like that's not a particular product prescription. It's more just like the legitimacy that can be brought by having people understand that these NFTs are something that exists. Not like a lot of people, it's like, oh, my NFT lives on OpeaSea, right? They've come to OpeaSea, they bought it on OpeaSea, my NFT lives on OpeaSea. Well, my NFT lives inside my wallet, right? Getting people to understand, okay, like actually these NFTs can be used across a whole ecosystem. They can be used on different platforms. They can be viewed in different apps or in different devices. That I think is really valuable. So like there's something that Google can definitely do for the legitimacy of the space. And the third is what I mentioned before, which is just consumer protection. Like I really care. Like it is so hard right now to keep yourself safe as a Web3 user, right? Even when you're doing the best job that you can when it comes to things like you're storing seed phrases. Like I'm not sure how many people here have had a lot of experience, like using a lot of DeFi products. You ask for support on Twitter, you'll immediately get people trying to scam you, posing as MetaMask support. Just like, what can Google do to keep users safer? Because every time that there are big hacks or that users are taken advantage of, that reduces the confidence in the whole space, and it makes people like game studios less likely to want to commit to it if they're like, hey, are we actually going to be able to keep our users safe for this, or are we setting them up for a big failure?
That's a really good point, and I think that makes a lot of sense as we've talked about like education and building guardrails. So I agree. Play Store, if you're listening, help us out. Alex, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. This was super insightful. I think we learned a lot, and we really hope one day we can have you back and hear more about the cool stuff you guys are building.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much for having me. Massively appreciate it. I hope you guys can build some amazing things.
Yeah, and how can people get in touch with you?
I mean, you can ping me on LinkedIn. You can ping me on Twitter. You can. I think those are probably the best two, I would say.
Cool. I'll drop that in the chat right now for people. So please reach out and say thanks. And again, Alex, thank you so much, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Yes.